Noble Lord notice that Lord Kerr did not come back and deny that the sort of discussions I suggested could take place and would implicitly involve conditions.
Notice. I did note it, but I've no comment to make on it.
I don't think it's for me to comment on the discussions in the European Council. Like Baroness Ludgrove, I don't know what happened when President Macron was arguing for a shorter extension in the last European Council. It is perfectly possible that there might be a dialogue with the British Prime Minister that would take place. But it is what is not possible is that there could be a conditional extension. The extension would be unconditional, because that is what the treaty says, or rather, the treaty contains no powers for imposing a conditional extension.
That being the entire point, therefore, I invite the noble Baroness to withdraw her amendment.
Lords, I think much more heavy weather has been made of this than I intended. A couple of opening comments. It's a pleasure to see the noble Lady Faulkner over here. And I have to say to the noble Lord Kerr, that those who draft law are not thereafter charged with interpreting it. Once they have launched their draft, it is over to others to interpret it. And I don't claim by any means to be a European lawyer, far from it. My point is very, very simple. If an extension is granted to the 30th of January, the Commons gets 2 days to consider it. If an extension is granted to the 31st of January, they get no time at all. I still have heard no reason or sense why that should be so. And I remain convinced that this was some sort of drafting oversight. Not to mention 2 days, no one's clarified that. Sitting days, calendar days. What if an offer comes at the weekend, during the Christmas recess, or sometime when we're not here? So I think since the lawyers themselves, both the noble and learned lords in this House, and those who are clearly just as learned but are mere QCs, have different opinions about this, it is quite possible that something that is a bit tricky may come our way at a time when we're not sitting, or may come our way when the Act provides no 2-day pause for the Commons. So either the Commons should have 2 days to consider anything, or it shouldn't have 2 days at all. I've heard no logical answer to that. I sense that it is the will of the House that I withdraw this now. But before report stage, I would expect to hear some sense from someone. I don't know who gave the draftsmen their orders. I haven't yet heard a sensible reason why an extension to the 30th of January gets 2 days consideration and to the 31st it doesn't.
Can I just try maybe and give an explanation? It is because the terms of Clause 3.1 specifically says 11 p.m. on the 31st of January 2020. And that would have been passed, by definition, that would have been passed by the House of Commons, as indeed it did on Wednesday of this week. Therefore, they don't really need 2 days to agree something they've already agreed to and put in statute.
I understand that point, but given that there has been disagreement enough to worry me about what the European Union might say, others who know much more than I do have expressed opinions of different sorts, and we're left with this 2-day definition. Nobody knows what it means. I think there is a real legal problem there. I don't know who drafted it. I don't know who gave the orders. We haven't really heard a logical answer. For now, I withdraw, with your leave, but I would expect someone to give a proper explanation at some stage during the course of the discussion, because we're in a bit of a legal pickle over that particular clause.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure this amendment be withdrawn? No. I therefore have to put the question on Amendment 2. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. Not content. The not contents have it. Also in clause 3, also in Amendment 3, in clause 3, Amendment 3, Baroness Fortner of Margravine, not moved. Amendment 4, Baroness Neville-Rolfe.
The House rightly scrutinises bills that come from the Commons, including private members' bill like this one. Right. My Lords, I apologise for my late arrival today. I moved a time-critical meeting very early, and then I got afflicted by the transport delay. Circumstances can upset timing, as we all know from our debates on these bills. Now, as my noble friend Lord Forsyth said, we have a duty in Parliament, and this House plays a key role, wherever we come from, to make clear that legislation works. Otherwise, I fear we will be held up to contempt in this country. They look upon us already with increasing incredulity, and that is a big concern. I just hope that the noble Lord Kerr is right on Amendment 2. Now, this is a committee stage, and my amendment, my Lords, is a probing amendment. I gave notice of my concern at second reading, and the noble Lord Rooker has only half answered my question. I am concerned that subsections 1 to 3 tie the government's hands too tightly and put UK interests in jeopardy, whatever the motivation for this bill, which was, of course, agreed in the other place. Please.
Order.
I do not understand, I will be brief, what subsection 4 does and how it interrelates with the rest of clause 3, or indeed the rest of the bill, and the sponsor's game plan for our relations with the EU once this bill becomes an act. I would also be keen, like others, to hear what is happening to the Kinnock Amendment, which the Minister explained yesterday to be defective. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed, page 3, line 21, leave out subsection 4.
This was a provision which was put into the Cooper-Letwin bill very much at the insistence of the government at the time. And the reason, no, I'm not trying to make a point against the government. The reason for it, and that's why I say it was from the government, was to preserve the prerogative of the government to be able to accept an amendment. At that stage it was thought it's possible that the European Council will offer an extension at a council meeting. Are you saying that the Prime Minister will not be able to accept it? And after consideration of that, it was put into the bill, into the Cooper-Letwin bill, that the Prime Minister should in fact be able to accept. Now what this does in this bill, in 3.4, is to say again, nothing will prevent the Prime Minister from agreeing to an extension, doesn't allow him to refuse an extension, but from agreeing to an extension of the period specified, otherwise in accordance with this section. So he doesn't have to go through the procedures if he wants to accept it. Now that is a way of preserving the prerogative of the privilege of the government to make agreements at an international level, but on that specific basis. So that's the reason for it. It's appropriate to have it in this bill too. The time for it actually to arise is limited, and I think if I understand correctly what Mr. Johnson has said about ditches, there's going to be no question of his agreeing to anything unless he's constrained by this bill. So it's an interesting question, but I think it's entirely academic. So in those circumstances, I hope that answers the noble lady's question, and we can move to complete committee.
Before he sits down, I wonder whether the noble lord could explain whether the Prime Minister, in a meeting faced with that question of a change along those lines, if there were conditions placed upon it in that meeting of the Council, how does this subclause address that possibility?
Given what the Prime Minister said, this is not going to happen. But the prerogative of the Prime Minister is retained under this provision, as it is in the other bill.
This is simply keeping free from constraint the prerogative of the Prime Minister, notwithstanding this bill. This bill simply deals with requiring the Prime Minister to apply for an extension. If he manages to get one anyway, that doesn't matter, and that's what's preserved. And there's no question at that stage, if you accept Lord Kerr's proposition about the nature of extensions, there's no question about conditions except temporal conditions. And therefore, what the Prime Minister here is allowed to do is what, apart from this bill, he'd be able to do, and this bill is an additional requirement on the Prime Minister when it's activated.
Can I just ask the House for forbearance and make quite sure that everybody on all sides is entirely in agreement that this extension, which the bill demands the Prime Minister seeks, is for one purpose only. Look at the Kinnock Amendment, the second part of Clause 1.4, and that is to try, and heaven knows I strongly support this, to get something like the May deal finally agreed, which I've long suggested it should be. But it would be quite unlawful, having got such an extension, for anybody then to say, but we must actually instead use it to retract Article 50 notice or to seek for a referendum or anything like that. We're all happy and agreed, are we, on that?
No. I want to be clear about that. There's certainly no commitment coming from this bench, these benches, that that's what the bill requires. If it's passed into law, it contains those words, but it does not constrain what the extension is used for.
My Lords, there's not much for me to say, although I alluded to this in the previous debate, the fact that Clause 3 is quite precisely drafted and subsection 4 is there to give the flexibility if other circumstances prevail. I'd forgotten about the Cooper-Letwin bill, having started off that myself in April, as to where it came from. In other words, it came from the current government on strike. So please put it in your bill. So we're happy to agree to the government's original plan to have it in the bill. Therefore, the noble lady did say it was a probing amendment, and I'll be very happy, therefore, if she withdraw it.
I'm grateful for the advice on all sides, good legal advice as to what this provision means. It's obviously a helpful provision, and I'm certainly not going to... I'm happy to withdraw my amendment. My concern is that this is an act without an end date, and so it is right to make sure that we understand the provisions and how they would work for the future. I beg to leave to withdraw my amendment.
Yeah. Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? The amendment is by withdrawn. The question is that Clause 3 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. The question is that Clauses 4 and 5 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. The question is that this be the title of the bill. Oh, schedule. Question is that, sorry. The question is that this be the schedule to the bill. As many...
I just want to say something about that. This is the print of the letter that the Prime Minister is required to send under the bill. And if there had been time, I would have proposed that the letter includes the reason, because after all, it's to the European Union that the reason is to be expressed, because as I understand it, the European Union say that if they're going to grant an extension, or are asked to grant an extension, they wish to have the reason. And therefore, in the ordinary course of events, it would be right to have the reason in the letter. Unfortunately, the time prevents that from happening. And therefore, I just want to say that it would have been better, but I'm sure that, what should I say, the initiative will be sufficient for the reason to be communicated to the European Union, even although it's not stipulated for in the letter, although the actual terms of the bill really say this is the letter. And so adding to it may have a certain amount of risk, but it may be a risk that properly should be taken. My Lord, so far as the noble and learned Lord's question about what this means is concerned, this is...
If he's arguing that the letter has got to have a reason in it, doesn't that mean that it's conditional? No.
It isn't. It is the condition that is obvious to give a reason why you have to apply for an extension or why you're applying for an extension, because the time point is, as Lord Kerr says, the important point, and they want to know how this time is to be taken up. That's the idea, and it seems to me to be perfectly sensible.
Obviously, he's far smarter at this than I am, but the noble Lord Kerr argued that it was not possible for any conditions to be applied. So why is it necessary for us to give a reason?
It seems to me to be obvious. If you're asked to make an extension, you don't just do it for the sake of doing it. You have some reason for it. And I don't think the European Union, far as it may be from common sense in many respects, for all I know, I don't think it's so daft that it provides for an extension to be applied for with no reason on earth why it should be granted. It seems to me to be common sense that the reason is required. And of course, the bill contains the reason, but just hasn't happened to put it in the letter. I suspect that perhaps what happened was a copying of the Cooper, the previous bill, and it didn't have the reason in it at all, as I pointed out at the time. So this bill is much better. It has got the reason in. Unfortunately, not so good that it has it in the letter as well. But as I say, I don't think that matters. So far, at least I don't think ultimately it will matter. So far as my noble friend, the noble and learned friend's question about the reason, I think it is quite important that the reason which is given in the bill is the reason which has to be given in support of the application for the amendment. And that I would certainly have suggested it goes in the letter if there had been time, but I appreciate fully that there isn't time, and therefore we must leave it as it is.
My Lords, besides what my noble and learned friend has just said about the letter and its deficiency in not including a reason, do your Lordships not think it would be much better if it also made clear what the parties are supposed to ratify? It simply says if the parties are able to ratify before this date, but there is no object of the sentence, there's no object of ratify. It's clear it refers to a withdrawal agreement. I can understand that. But I think that it's very sloppy drafting, and it could be argued that it referred to the ratification of something else.
Responding to Lord Mackay, we spoke outside the chamber last night because he raised this right at the end. I mean, he's got a very valid point. But the bill, as it is still sufficient, and we are under the prorogation guillotine. If we weren't, then we would have some flexibility. It's the prorogation guillotine has removed the flexibility from the House to deal with that.
I apologise for forgetting the letter. The question is that this be the schedule to the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. The question is that this be the title of the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. My Lords, that concludes the committee's proceedings. The House will now resume. My Lords, the Committee of the Whole House, to which the European Union Withdrawal No. 6 Bill was committed, has gone through the same and has directed me to report it to your Lordships without amendment.
My Lords, the House will now adjourn to allow for amendments to be tabled for report stage. The Public Bill Office will be open to receive amendments for the next 30 minutes. The House will then resume as soon after that as possible, and timings will be displayed on the Annunciator.
The question is that the House adjourn during pleasure. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
Report of European Union Withdrawal Number 6 Bill. Lord Rooker.
My Lords, I beg to move that this report be now received.
The question is that this report be now received. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The content sound. In Clause 1, Amendment 1, Lord Forsyth of Drumlin.
My Lords, I don't want to detain the House in any way, but no, seriously. But it may be of assistance to your Lordships if I explain why I put down this amendment. And it arises actually from an exchange which we had at the earlier committee stage of the bill, where my noble and learned friend, Lord Mackay of Clashfern, queried why the letter which the Prime Minister is required to send under the schedule to this bill did not include a reason. And we had an exchange about if you had to have a reason, surely that would be a condition. And he said the reason is in the bill. And the reason is indeed in the bill, and it's the bit that I want to take out. It's page 2, line 14, from 220 to the end of line 20. And I'm not sure how many of your Lordships have actually studied this and thought about the implications of it. It's written, of course, in language which makes it less easy to understand. But essentially, what it's saying is that I'll read it. It says that the letter has to be sent in order to debate and pass a bill to implement the agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union under Article 52 of the Treaty on European Union, including provisions reflecting the outcome of inter-party talks as announced by the Prime Minister on the 21st of May 2019, and in particular the need for the United Kingdom to secure changes to the political declaration to reflect the outcome of those inter-party talks. So that means that we're asking the Prime Minister to send a letter not only saying that he wants to debate the May deal and the subsequent matters that were agreed between the parties, but also that he intends to pass a bill when the Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear that he is determined not to do that, and more particularly, for those members who've argued about the supremacy of the House of Commons, it is a deal which has been rejected by the House of Commons on 3 separate occasions. So here we have a piece of legislation which, by agreement between the front benches, is being given safe passage, and I don't wish to I certainly don't support the bill, but I certainly don't wish to delay it if that is what the government wants. But what on earth is going on with the government? Why have the government not tabled an amendment to take this out? Because it does not reflect the government's declared policy, nor does it reflect the view that the House of Commons has taken on 3 separate occasions. And so I went to have a look at the Hansard of the House of Commons to find out how this had got into this bill. And it's got into this bill by accident. The Labour Party's position in the other place was to abstain on this matter. And I'm the author of it, showing that some families stick together, was a certain Stephen Kinnock. And it said, and at column 262, my noble friend Lord Cormac says he's a good chap. I know we're a broad church, but at column 262 of the 4th of September, he is quoted as saying, on this matter, I understand that our position at the present time would be to abstain, and I'm not 100% sure of that. So what happened was that the promoters of this bill, my noble and learned friend Lord Mackay, corrected me quite correctly at committee stage. I said it was the government that had failed to put in tellers for the division. And of course, I'm confused because in my day, it was only the government that actually proposed business motions and matters of that kind. But of course, it was the promoters of this bill who failed to provide tellers for the bill, which is how this has ended up in the bill. So we have in that section of the bill a provision which the Labour Party did not want, they were going to abstain on, and the government can't possibly have wanted. And I'm as good as my word. I said I wouldn't seek to delay the implementation of this legislation if that is what has been agreed between the parties. But it does strike me as extraordinary, and I did not table an amendment at the committee stage, which I would have done in the normal way, because I expected the government to put down an amendment to deal with this, and the government have not done so. And I have to say to my noble friend, I would be very grateful indeed if he could explain why the government are leaving in a bill which they are proposing to support a provision which requires the Prime Minister to give an which requires the Prime Minister to write a letter for the purpose of giving an undertaking to debate and pass a bill to implement the May compromise, so-called, agreement, and also the discussions that took place between the Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister and the Labour Party, which include giving assurances about regulatory requirements and the rest. It does seem very extraordinary, and that is the reason behind the amendment which I beg to move.
The clause 1, page 2, line 14, leave out from 2020 to end of line 20.
My Lords, I very much hope that the House will not be seduced by the silver tongue of my noble friend, Lord Mackay of Drumley. He... that was... I apologise profusely to my noble friend, and of course nobody could possibly confuse an erudite lawyer with... My Lords, it is, I think, important that this bill goes through as it came from the House of Commons. And I say that for one reason above all others, and that is that I believe that this particular Kinnock amendment gives an opportunity to bring to a seemly end the wrangling, the disputes that have taken place. There are many in your Lordship's House, in all parts of this House, who would have supported the Theresa May deal. And that was made plain in debate after debate. We never had the opportunity specifically to divide on it, but it was quite clear that a large number of very influential crossbenchers, a large number of my friends on the other side of the House and on this side of the House too would have accepted it. And I believe it would have been a sensible decision. And of course, in the other House, we must remind ourselves that when it came up for the third time of asking, Mr. Boris Johnson, not then the Prime Minister, voted for it. Mr. Rees-Mogg voted for it. And the government in its entirety voted for it. I know there was a great clear-out of the government, but it really is entirely reasonable that people should have had a chance to reflect after a change of leader, seeing the stark reality of falling off the cliff of no deal, that we should have a chance to revisit this, not least because my noble friend, the Minister, and I'm delighted that he's on the front bench at the moment, my noble friend, the Minister, has repeatedly said this very week how hard he had fought to get the May deal through. And indeed he did, and I gave him constant support throughout those debates. And my Lords, therefore, this is no backtracking, it's a recognition of what we can do to bring this long three-year saga to a decent end. And then we can move forward to a general election in due time, having agreed with our friends and allies in the European Union the terms of exit. And I remind honourable lords, noble lords in all parts of the House, that, as I've used the words before, this is only the beginning of the beginning. There are many, many long months and years ahead of negotiating, but it would be far better to negotiate from a base of amity and accord than from a base of discord. And that could well be the chance, indeed would be the case, if we came out without a deal, because acrimony would be the prevailing emotion, and that's not a good thing. My lords, I hope my noble friend, Lord Forsyth, will not have succeeded on this occasion in seducing you with his silver tongue, and I beg to oppose this amendment.
My Lords, I raised the issue yesterday of the opportunities that rest within the political declaration for a solution to the problem which the country faces may be there. The offer from the Commission is still open for the government of the day to have negotiations and discussions on finding a way through on the backstop linked to the political declaration. And I asked the Minister twice yesterday why, as yet, the government have not yet taken up the opportunity of embarking on a negotiation along those lines to try to find a way through, which in turn would link with the deal negotiated by Mrs May. If, as Lord Forsyth wishes, he spotted it, we take this out, that prevents that opportunity. It prevents that opportunity being in the bill with the opportunity of taking it forward. So those of us who are looking for a way through, who are being prepared to shift the grounds to a degree, to find the accommodation, to try to get some healing of the divisions which exist, should be very vigorously indeed opposing what Lord Forsyth presents to you, asking the Minister and the Government to pick up the opportunity offered by the Commission to negotiate on the political declaration there and find a way forward. And then, in turn, we should be getting this bill through the House very quickly today as the basis of moving forward.
My Lords, I'd like to support my noble friend Lord Forsyth. I'm rather surprised by Lord Cormac because he's always been a great champion of the revising powers of this chamber. And when there's a bill that comes before us, which clearly has got a clause in it which is a complete mistake, and then the proposers of the bill didn't even intend it to be there, surely it is our job to send it back to the Commons, who've already organised to accept Lord's amendments on Monday, and they can then accept my noble friend's amendment, and it'll go through anyway. It won't delay the bill, it won't make the slightest difference. It'll actually make the bill better than it is already. And I think it's quite extraordinary that when a mistake has been made like this, and it's widely acknowledged by everybody that this was a mistake, it was because the proposers of the bill didn't put in tellers. Seems to be a bit amateur, in my opinion, but there we are. That's what they did. That we are not in a position to put the bill right and to actually concur with the wishes of the other place, who will then pass the amendment in the other place, and nothing will change in terms of the timing or anything else. So I can't understand why my noble friend Lord Forsyth's amendment has been resisted in any way whatsoever.
The noble lord say that this was a mistake, and I'm just curious about how he knows it was a mistake. Has he got some inside knowledge, not just gossip?
Have the inside knowledge that the Labour Party wanted to abstain on this, and there was no way this amendment would have been carried if tellers hadn't been put through by the proposers of the bill.
My Lords, I wasn't intending to intervene. However, I seem to have become very swiftly a member that this House doesn't want to hear from. And that, my Lords, my Lords, has been confirmed because this House does not care for certain inconvenient truths or truths. My Lords, I only rise to say that In 22 years in the service of this House, first in usual channels and then having the honour to be a member of the House, I have never made the practice of commenting publicly on usual channels discussions, and I do not do so now. The only thing that I will say, for the record, should be placed on the record, is at a certain significant hour, in the small hours of Thursday morning, it was my understanding that this amendment would, by agreement, be removed. My Lords, that was clearly a misunderstanding.
My Lords, I would have preferred not to see the Kinnock Amendment in the bill, whether or not it was a mistake. As the noble Lord Kerr pointed out in committee, it's not open to the European Union to impose conditions on an extension, and the suggestion of the purpose that is sought to be removed by this amendment suggests that there could be conditions. It is certainly not possible for the European Union to impose conditions on the conduct of the British government during the period of any extension. But if you read the words that are sought to be removed that were in the Kinnock Amendment, they are so woolly as to be meaningless. They refer to the outcome of cross-party talks that was uncertain, and the talks indeed were abandoned. And I believe, along with the promoters of the bill in the House of Commons and here, that the words of the Kinnock Amendment would have no legal effect whatever. I say to the noble Lords, Lord Cormac and Lord Brooke of Overthorpe, that there is nothing whatever in this bill as it stands to prevent the negotiation of a deal by the government if that were negotiated and if it were then passed through the House of Commons. But the central point here is that we have to live with the Kinnock Amendment. We need to vote against Lord Forsyth's amendment because we are under the time constraints of the prorogation. Yeah. Whatever Lord Hamilton says about the opportunity that there may be on Monday morning, we cannot foretell what might happen in the Commons on Monday morning if we sent back amendments, and I therefore urge the House to reject this amendment, which will not affect the central thrust of the bill in any way.
So tolerant of democracy. Could I rise and support Lord Forsyth's suggested amendment on one reason only? And that is that there is not a small businesswoman or a small businessman in this land who hasn't had this place and the other place up to here. And they just want everybody to get on with it and give the businesses of the land that generate the profit, that pay the tax, that build the schools and hospitals, the chance to get on and make money, employ people, pay tax. They hold us all in very high disrepute at the moment. All of us. The political class have let this country down and they've let business down, and that is not a partisan point. We should, all of us, of every party in both places, look into our souls about what we have done to this country in so many ways. If these people who have had us in such high disregard actually thought that we spent a Friday afternoon accepting the fact that something that is factually inaccurate we just knocked through on the nod, they would think we were even worse than they think right now. I thought that my noble Lord Brooke's point was excellent. I thought the chance of coming together, the chance of healing, you used the word, and I thought it was excellent, has a lot of merit in it. But we surely cannot actually knowingly vote for something which is just factually wrong. And on that basis, I would support the amendment. I don't think it will hold up anything on Monday. But then we ought to go from this place after this debacle is over and just start trying to have respect to the optics that the businesses of this country, the businesswomen and businessmen, the good people of this country have had enough of us. And if we don't start communicating with them as to why we are on their side, then God help us.
think it's just right to say that this amendment proposed to delete what's in the bill strikes me as rather unnecessary, apart from the fact that we have difficulty in time. But in my view, this amendment proposed by Mr. Stephen Kinnock, distinguished member of a distinguished family, was perfectly in order. And the fact that in the procedures of the House of Commons it has gone into the bill and is in the bill that we have read for the second time and which we have passed in committee stage and now on report stage strikes me as perfectly in order. Now, it says that it makes the important distinction, which I've tried to make yesterday, between the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. And it has always seemed to me that the Irish backstop has really of the character of a future relationship. What's objected to is the fact that it's permanent or said to be permanent and so on. And that's part of the future relationship. And therefore I've always felt that the backstop is not of itself an objection to the withdrawal agreement as such. There may be other objections, but so far as the backstop is concerned, it is part of the future relationships in the aspect of it to which objection has been taken. And therefore, I would welcome the idea that the House of Commons had a discussion separating out these two, which the Kinnock Amendment does with complete accuracy. And I don't believe for a minute that it doesn't make sense. I think it's perfectly readable and perfectly understandable, even for lawyers. Now, in my view, therefore, this should stay in. My noble friend says he expected the government to object to it. The government are not for the whole of this bill. I mean, the whole thing is a private member's bill by a group which were not part of the government as such. They may have included members who were previously in the government, but at any rate, it's not a government bill, and therefore it's the government that don't care for it at all. So why they should have to amend or propose an amendment to a particular part of it, I don't know. I think it's perfectly right that they hadn't done so. I understand that they've been advised that it's meaningless. I don't agree with that, and I don't think anybody who reads it will think it's meaningless. It's perfectly clear what's wanted. And I think it's the foundation, in a proper sense, of the basis on which an extension is asked for. Now, it's said that, in accordance with Lord Kerr's formulation, that no conditions are attached. But I think if you apply for an extension, the European Union require a reason, which seems to be perfectly good common sense. And if you give a reason, good faith suggests that that is the reason. And therefore, it seems to me that it promotes the likelihood that something may suddenly emerge which distinguishes between the political formulation and the withdrawal agreement, which is really the vital thing to get through in time.
Perhaps it would be helpful for the House if I say a few words about this amendment. Let me say initially that both my noble friends, Lord Forsyth and Lord True, are essentially correct, except in one important detail. And let me say to Lord True that even if the rest of the House doesn't want to hear from him, I do, because I think he speaks a lot of good sense on these issues. It is perfectly true that originally, at some late hour on Wednesday evening, it was, and it's a fast-moving event, it was our intention to ask the House to remove this amendment. But since then, we've looked at it further, and what Lord Forsyth said, which is not correct, is that the government absolutely does not support this bill, and we do not favour it. We think it is flawed, and we think that this Kinnock Amendment tries, but does not succeed, to make it even worse. The amendment is confusingly drafted. It is contradictory to the aims of the rest of the bill, and its deficiencies are such that the effect is rendered pointless. Now, I hesitate always to disagree with my noble friend Lord Mackay, but certainly my strong advice is that this amendment is legally inoperable. It appears to be contradictory with other parts of the bill because it requires an extension to pass legislation to implement a deal when, of course, under this bill, the extension is only being sought because no deal has been agreed. So for all those reasons, as I said, we think it's inoperable and largely pointless. But I can happy to say that it was our original intention to take it out, and indeed we had discussions to that effect. So Lord True is absolutely correct, as always. But since then, we've looked at the matter further.
I'm grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for helping the House at this stage explain what the government's position is. We don't support this amendment, and in short, and the Noble Lord the Minister has now said it, given the view that the government has taken that the Kinnock Amendment is in fact legally inoperable, it does no harm to keep it in the bill, and therefore we see no reason. I don't know why Noble Lords are laughing, because the critical point, which was made by Lord Cormac, is that the bill has to pass. We do not have the time to send anything back. No, we do not have the time to send it back to the House of Commons, given the guillotine of prorogation imposed by the Prime Minister.
My Lords, in principle, Lord Forsyth makes a very seductive case, and I say in principle. Lord Cormac made the point about the House of Commons might want to look at it again. I don't see any contradiction, the fact they rejected the deal 3 times. If they wished, it's their choice. It's the meaningful vote is theirs, not ours. And it's a soft Brexit. It's Brexit in name only. No question about it. And they are free any time they wanted, the Commons, to fix their business to do it. Nothing to do with us, because we're not part of the meaningful vote process. So it's not our job in that way to manipulate the way they organise their business on an issue that we have got nothing to do with. So in some ways, it grieves me to say that we can't do our proper scrutiny. And I have to say, there is a complete breakdown of trust. Just because the government says there'll be time in the Commons on Monday to deal with this bill, any amendment sent down there can be amended. And something in lieu can come back. The idea that this is a sewn deal, forget it. Trust has broken down. The prorogation guillotine is there. We have no choice. And therefore, I ask the Noble Lord Forsyth if he'd be kind enough to withdraw his amendment.
Oh, my goodness. I have to say to the Noble Lord Rooker, whom I have great admiration for, that I'm struggling with that response, because what the words say is that the letter should be sent requesting an extension by the Prime Minister in order to not just debate, but debate and pass a bill. That he has to send a letter saying he wants an extension because he's planning to pass a bill to implement the May Agreement, which has been rejected 3 times. And indeed, the Noble Lord Brooker's absolutely right, and to put in place the results of the discussions, which I don't have the information on other than what I've read in the newspapers, can be implemented. Now, that is anticipating the decisions by the House of Commons. However, Lord Cormac, in his response, he said that he supported the May deal, and there were many people who supported the May deal, but the May deal was rejected by the biggest vote ever in the other place. The Noble Lord Brooke, he said it prevents us from, and I think he's got a very good point here about the political agreement, about having discussions, and I think he may be right in his criticism that not enough has been done to take that part of the thing forward. But taking out this defective part of the bill doesn't prevent discussions being placed. And I think my noble friend Lord Hamilton made an absolutely crucial point, which is, if the thing's deficient and everybody agrees it's deficient, what is this House for? if it's not actually to deal with those matters. And when the Lord Rooker says that you can't trust, that there's a matter of trust, well, I wouldn't. My noble friend, Lord True, said that I'm most grateful to my noble friend, Lord Callanan, for his honesty and transparency. We were under the impression that the deal agreed between the front benches would result in this matter being taken out, and he has confirmed that. And we're now being told it's not being taken out because the legal advice is that it wouldn't fly anyway. So we put into the bill something which is legally deficient, and that's okay, and that's what this House has come to. And we do that because we don't believe that the government will be as good as their word when the people who were on the other side of the agreement have not been as good as their word. Well, I'm sorry, I hope that the government is rather better than that. And we have a duty here to pass legislation which is proper. Now, I am not a lawyer, but Lord Marx, in his contribution to this debate, told us that it would have no legal effect whatsoever. And my noble friend, the Lord Mackay of Clashfern, not Drumleen, he gave us the opposite advice. So there is at least some doubt, it would appear, as to whether or not it would have legal effect. My noble and learned friend, Lord Mackay, said it wasn't meaningless. And Lord Marx said he agreed that, I hope I'm not pushing too far here, he agreed it should not be there, but because it was meaningless, it could stay there. And the noble Lord Jones told us that the entire country was sick to death with all of this. Well, on that, I'm sure we can all agree. Yeah. We are.
Well, I'm going to ask you this question, then, even so. I'm going because the noble Lord has questioned the comments that have been made about trust. I wonder if he wanted, in that context, to comment on what the Prime Minister said this morning, which was that he said that he will not seek an extension, even if it's passed in law. Does that change his view on whether there is a question of trust that is at play here?
No, it doesn't change my view, because what the Prime Minister says he will or will not do has nothing whatever to do with what the law of the land is. And here... and he has made it... What he says he will do has nothing whatever to do with what the law of the land is as decided by both Houses of Parliament. And I would expect every single parliamentarian to obey the law of the land. And there is a responsibility on us, therefore, to ensure in passing the law that there is absolute clarity about what it means and what it does. And for this House, and particularly for the noble Lord with his vast experience, when his own party were not prepared to vote for this matter, they were going to abstain on it. And when it only came into the bill because tellers were not put in by the amateurs at the other end who'd taken control of the agenda, for him to suggest that we should leave it in, whilst at the same time making that point, I think makes my argument.
Noble Lord for giving way. Is the Noble Lord really saying that after we had the assurance yesterday from the Noble Lord Callanan, the Minister, in response to the Noble Lord Goldsmith, that the government would fully comply with this bill once it becomes an act? Not only would it get royal assent, but the government would comply. But almost simultaneously, the Prime Minister was saying he'd be dead in a ditch before he sent an extension. Does the Noble Lord think that we should rely on the Noble Lord, the Minister's assurance on behalf of the government, while the Prime Minister is saying something completely different? Does that not undermine trust, not only in the Prime Minister, but in the assurance we got from the Minister yesterday?
I'm so tired of this political argy-bargy. If the Prime Minister is dead in a ditch, he's not the government. And we are at this stage in considering these proceedings. We are talking about ensuring that we have clear and effective law. And that is why I put down this amendment. And I have to say to my noble friend Lord Cowan, he didn't really give me a satisfactory answer, although I appreciate the answer he gave me, when he said that the government had decided that they weren't, after all, going to take this out because they'd had advice that it wouldn't have any effect. Advice which is contrary to what we've heard from perhaps our most distinguished former Lord Chancellor. So I'm sorry, but I do not wish my name to be associated with legislation passed by this House which is defective, and I intend to test the opinion of the House.
Is Amendment 1 be agreed to? As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content?
Not content!
I think the not content have it. Clear the bar. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content.
Not content.
The contents will go to the right by the throne, the not contents to the left by the bar. Order. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to.
That's a surprise.
My Lords, there have voted contents 47, not contents 268. So the not contents have it. In clause 5, amendment to Lord True.
My Lords, if I may, my Lords, I would start by saying that when an agreement is reached in usual channels, in my view, that agreement is an agreement that must hold. Not only was an agreement made in usual channels, but I also, in the course of that, gave personal assurances that there would be no effort made to delay the progress of this bill, and I stand by that assurance. I didn't take any part yesterday, and I do not intend, and I hope this will not be made the occasion of a prolonged debate. The debate we've just had took no more than 3/4 of an hour. I would hope that this one, it's up to members of the House whether they're interested in the remarks I'm about to make, but I would hope, my Lords, that it's not the occasion of a very prolonged debate, and without being discourteous to any member of your Lordship's House, if it does appear that it is tending in that direction, I will try to rise to, or hope that the noble Lord Rooker will rise, and I would support that, to attempt to bring it to a close without any need for the nonsense, the repugnant nonsense of the closure motion we had yesterday. But, my Lords, I do wish to bring one point of principle to this House, and I wish to ask this House publicly to determine the matter. And I shall be pressing the amendment. I shall move to a division, my Lords, in which each and every member of this House will publicly have to declare their position on the simple matter, the simple proposition that I put before your Lordships. And that is this, that the Act, which will be an Act when it passes from this House and goes to the other place, should not come into force until the British people have had a chance to decide the matter in a general election. Now, yesterday there was talk that the Labour Party might be accepting a general election, now there isn't, and so on. I'm not really particularly concerned about who said what when. My Lords, I agree with all those who say that somehow we need to bring a conclusion to this matter. And in the history of our great democracy, my Lords, in the times of greatest crisis and doubt, the way in which that is done, has been done, and please God, always will be done, is by recourse to the people, to ask the people of this country to decide the matter in a general election. And yes, my Lords, in a general election, not in some second referendum or a first referendum or a third or a fourth, which is cooked up by a majority of the time with the power to decide the question. Let the people decide who governs.